We've dealt a lot in the Space VFX course with procedural texturing, but there is kind of a big problem with that when it comes to render time. Space and time may be infinite, but no one on their deathbed ever said they wish they'd spent more time rendering. So in this tip, we'll take a look at how to claw back some of that time. Hi, this is AD Burrows here with a bonus tip from the Space VFX Elements series by myself and Gleb Alexandrov. So you'll likely already know we can get endless texturing versatility using procedural texturing, and we can get resolution busting high frequency details without the signs of repetition that we'd see if we scaled an equivalent tiling image instead. And we can even generate procedural animations to get some cool animated clouds. But with each frame, there's a bunch of calculations needed to be made, each adding a tiny amount to the render time. Those can eventually add up. Well, if we're satisfied with the result, we can remove all of those calculations by using an identical image instead. And how do we get that image? With baking, of course. So let's strap in and launch into it. Let's take a look at this planet. I'll simplify it a bit by turning off the atmosphere and the clouds objects. And we're just left with the planet procedural object that in the node editor down here we have this material, which kind of looks like somebody smashed a load of circuit boards and threw spaghetti at it down here. But just to analyze it a little bit, the blue nodes that I've stuck in here are just image textures which are baked. And so what we're actually looking at is a baked version of all this procedural stuff that goes on behind each blue node. So let's zoom into one of those baked texture nodes. I'll zoom into this one down here, which is sat in front of this color frame. This image texture node is just coming into the diffuse shaders color. So what we can do is just come back over here. And if we've got the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, which we should have, let's go Control Shift and click on this image texture node. And we can see the results of just this one texture node plugged into an emission shader, which makes it nice and fast to visualize in the viewport for us. But if we were to Control and left click on this little output from the color, just to drag over our connections into the output of what our color frame is doing, we can see it's basically the same thing. But now Blender is having to calculate all of this stuff instead of just rendering this one node. So what we want to do is we'll rebake and get our speed back. So like baking a cake, there are some ingredients we'll need. We need an object, of course, and we need to know what we're going to bake. In this case, let's start off with the diffuse color, the results of this node basically. And we also need an image to bake onto. I have this image editor open, so just for simplicity, I'm going to come down to image and then click on new image. And then let's rename this to bake tut. Let's set the resolution to something like 2048 by 2048. Then I'll just click on the OK, and that generates that image for us. Another ingredient we need is an image texture node with this image inside it. So let's go Shift A and go Texture Image Texture Node, and then left click to drop that in. And then from the pull down that we get next to the Open button, we can find our Bake Tut image. And now whatever image texture node that we have selected in here will be where we're baking to. Now another important ingredient that we need for baking is for the object to have some UVs. Now if I tab into edit mode on this planet, you can see I do have some UVs on it, so we're good to go in that regard. And then the final ingredient is to come over to the rendering tab and to manipulate any of our baking settings, and we'll find them just at the bottom. So if I middle click and drag down, we'll see there's our baking controls. There is one other thing to consider though, and that's the sampling settings, since if we take our render samples value there, the more samples the cleaner the image, but the longer it'll take. Now we can move on to chapter 2 and actually do some baking. We can leave everything at default for the moment and hit that bake button. Wait for it to render, and then congratulations, we are done. I'll also resize this window slightly just to give us a little bit more space on the UV image editor. It may take a few minutes to finish baking, but once it has, what we'll need to do is come down to the image and then save as image, and then navigate to somewhere to save it. I've called it Earth_DC for diffuse color for the moment. I'm just going to cancel that since I've already saved it. But then what we're going to need to do is create a new image texture node in the node editor. So Shift A, image texture, and then click on open. Navigate to wherever it is. I've got this other one here, Earth_DC. I'm just going to load that one in. And then what we can do is Control left click on this output here and just drag it to this node instead. And as you can see, nothing changes, but we have removed all that procedural calculation that was required, and now we're going to be speeding up our render in the process. So as I say, the render took a little while, and it's way slower than it needs to be. So let's see if we can speed it up a little bit. So let's go up to the sampling section, and we can see we're set to 90 samples at the moment. Because we're using an emission shader, we don't need all those samples. So let's take it right down to just one sample. At one sample, it'll still look clean, but it's going to go much faster. It could be slightly faster still, since we're actually set to combined, which is all render passes being considered, and we only need the emit pass since this is going into the emit shader. So let's switch that over to emit. Then when we bake, it'll actually even be slightly faster. We don't have to take the emit pass though. We could hook this up to a diffuse pass and actually just deselect direct and indirect and just take the color option. Though if you just want a map unaffected by lighting, as we do in this case, the emit pass will actually be faster. So I'm going to switch that back to emit. So let's reselect our bake tut image node, and then let's click bake, and then it's done in just a couple of seconds. In this example, I ended up baking a few others, such as the roughness here. I replaced with this baked image. Let's Control Shift click on it to see it. Again, all I did was Control Shift click on this final node in the frame that we've got here, and then just again select with emit selected from the bake type, baked it, and then saved it out as another image. And at the top here we have another one which is just for the lights that are on the planet, on the dark side of things. And then we also have this bump. One I'd like to add a special mention to though is the bump map. And again, all I did was hook this up to an emission node. So I Control Shift clicked on the final node that was informing the bump node. And now that's hooked up to an emission shader. I just came over to the emit pass and then gave it a good old bake. But you have to be careful with this though. And let me show you what I mean. Let's just set up a simple gradient going from one side of the planet to the other. So let's go Shift A, add in a texture, gradient texture. Let's just have this inform the height of our bump node for a minute. So let's Control Shift click on this, and we're going to get some funky colors representing our node information there. And if we zoom right in here, everything should look fairly smooth going straight across. So with that in mind, let's Control Shift click on the gradient texture so we can see what's happening. And then I'm going to tab out of edit mode back into object mode here. And that's because I want to rotate the planet around. So let's go R and then Z just to rotate it around on its axis. And you can see the gradient there going from the dark side on the left to a lighter side on the right. And now what we want is our image node to bake onto. So let's grab this bake tut image node over here. Let's press G, move it up a little bit. And then what we'll do is just make sure it's selected, come over to here and click bake. Now what I'll do is go image, save as image. And then let's call this Earth and then underscore B for bump. And now let's just save that out. And let's duplicate this bake tut. And then let's press open image. And then we'll find our Earth underscore B there. Let's open that. Now it still says bake tut there. So I'm just going to click on the number 2 there and just make sure that this is Earth underscore B for the bake. So let's Control Shift click on it, and now let's hook that up to the height instead of the gradient, and all looks the same for now. Let's Control Shift click on the bump here though, and if we zoom in even further now, you can start to see there's a little bit of an issue. You'll notice some banding or stepping in the results instead of a nice smooth surface, though it may be kind of subtle, especially with video compression. To get around this, we need a higher bit depth. So we'll need to make sure when creating our image, so let's go image and then new image, we want to make sure we click on this 32-bit float. So let's click that and we'll call this bake 32-bit, again at 2048 by 2048. And let's click OK. And then with this one here, this will be what we're baking. Let's find that bake 32-bit there. Control Shift click our gradient texture again to hook it up. Make sure we've got our bake 32-bit selected, and then we can come over and click bake. Once that's done, we can click on image and then save as image, select Earth underscore B. But what we need is we want to make sure we're using a file format which can handle at least 16-bit. PNG in this case will be fine. I'm just going to click on save image to overwrite that. And then let's Control Shift click on our bump node again. And there we go, it's all nice and smooth this time. To try to emphasize it for the video, I've increased the contrast and scaled the image right up, and now I'm toggling between the low bit depth and the high bit depth. Hopefully you can clearly see the smooth versus step difference there. Another consideration is that often you can get values outside of 0 and 1, or in other words black and white, and in those cases you'll need a file format that can handle the full 32-bit range of information such as OpenEXR. So if in doubt, just use that. And that, space travelers, is all we need for our space baking adventures. So thanks very much for joining us on this quick tip tutorial in the Space VFX Elements series by Gleb Alexandrov and me, 80 Burrows.